Welcome to Just Grace It, a production of Grace Life Bible Church dedicated to teaching and establishing believers in the principles of the grace life.
Underneath the blood, through the cleansing flood, guilt is left behind, never brought to mind. I'm running up to God, underneath the blood.
Ready? Let's join Pastor Brian Ross, rightly dividing the word and discussing grace.
I want you to keep in
through
mind
faith.
a few things. The primary thrust or goal or job of the gospel of the grace of God is to deliver men from the slavery to sin. Did you catch that? What is the primary job of the gospel? To get you out of Adam and put you where? In Jesus Christ. To redeem you out of the slave market of sin and give you a right standing in the righteousness of God imputed to your account. That is the primary focus and thrust of the gospel. And what Paul emphasized in his preaching was a God with man relationship, or man being reconciled to who? God, through the death of God's Son, Jesus Christ. So my point to you is this. Paul did not run around the ancient world and preach emancipation from slavery. He preached the gospel of the grace of God, which emancipated people from their sin and gave them a position in Jesus Christ. That was the primary job and goal of Paul's preaching. Now, therefore, we must remember two things as we consider some of these verses. Number one, Paul did not write these things as a man. These are not his own private, subjective opinions. Rather, he wrote them as the spokesman of God by divine inspiration. Okay? That's an important thing to consider. And number two, we should not conclude from this that Paul favored slavery, because he did not. Come with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Verse 21. He says, "Art thou being called a servant?" Notice, care not for it. In other words, does he tell you to like it? He says, care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it what? If there was a legal way that a slave could be made free, Paul said that that slave should do what? Seek it. So you have to understand that Paul is not pro-slavery or promoting slavery. He's saying that as a believer, that person that is a position of servitude has an obligation first as a testimony and a witness to God first. Verse 22, "For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's" what? You see that? Even if there was a believer who was in the position of being a slave, in the eyes of the Lord, that person was the Lord's what? Free man. So it didn't matter what the people around them said about it. What God's saying about it is that person was a free man. But notice what else it says. "Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Christ" what? In other words, if you are not in a position of servitude, do you have more freedom and latitude to go serve Christ? Yes. So we have to have a complete understanding here of what it is that the Scriptures are teaching about this. Now think about this. If Paul had told slaves who became believers that they should no longer work or refuse to obey their masters, think of the opposition this would have unleashed against the gospel. Just think about it for a minute. Do Christians need to do anything out of the ordinary to get people mad at us? No. So if Paul's primary teaching is this, if you are in this condition, this is how you live. If you are able to get out of it, you should seek to what? To get out of it. But if you cannot, here is how you conduct yourself in that position as a believer, a member of the church, the body of Christ. That is essentially what he's saying here. All right? Now, it is important also to note that Paul's instructions in all of his epistles to those who find themselves in a servile condition is to work as unto the Lord and not unto who? Men. And we will see that as we go through here this morning. So, while slavery is a sad chapter in American history. Thankfully, none of us find ourselves under this system today in 21st century America. So you might ask yourself, well, what relevance does this passage then have for me today as, where I am? And I'm going to say to you that this passage has a lot of relevance if you apply it to your work life. Okay, now come back with me to Titus and let's look at what it says. Most of us are not in the position of being the boss, are we? So that means we've got somebody that's what? Over us. Somebody that we have to answer to. Titus chapter 2, look at verse 9. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters, and to please them well in all things, not answering again. So let's start looking at this. First he writes Titus and he says, exhort servants to be obedient. The word exhort means to incite by words or advise. Okay? To urge by arguments to a good deed or to a laudable conduct or course of action. So the idea in exhorting is to do what? Encourage people to do what's right, is the general idea of what it means to exhort. So he says, exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. Now, the word servants, notice what it says, who's he supposed to exhort? Exhort servants. The word servant, the same Greek word is translated slave at least 200 times. All right? So we are definitely talking about here somebody who is a bondman, a man of servile condition, or what we would call a slave. So he is clearly addressing this portion of the population of the local church when he writes verses 9 and 10. Now, all that being said, we see very clearly then from the first two words that Paul wanted Titus to give specific instructions to believers who were slaves or found themselves in a servile condition. All right? Because these are the instructions that Titus is to give to these saints. All right? Slaves, notice what it says. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. It's very clear. We don't really even have to explain it very much. Slaves were instructed to be obedient unto their own masters. This is the same word. Look at verse 5. To be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, obedient to their own what? Husbands. The same word that he uses in verse 9 to describe the master-servant relationship is the same word that he uses in chapter 2, verse 5 to describe the wife's position in relationship to the husband. So he says in verse 9, exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. So we don't have to go into that. We already know what that means. Okay? Was Paul's instruction here that the slave, the bondman, would listen to the instructions that the master gave? Yeah, that's what it says. Now, come over to Colossians chapter 3 for a minute. Colossians chapter 3, look at verse 22. Notice what it says. He says, servants, obey in all things your masters, according to the flesh. Notice, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing who? God. So eye service means service rendered to please the eyes. That i.e., you all know that there's somebody at your job who only works when the boss is around. You all know that that's true. Hopefully it's not you. Okay? Because to render only eye service is not becoming us as believers. That's what Paul's saying here. Look at what the verse says. Not with eye service as what? Men pleasers. Men pleasers defines the servant or the one who works hard while the master or the boss or the overseer is watching. But he does not have a genuine interest in what he is doing, but is only interested in making a good impression where the master or the overseer is present. All right? You all know what I'm talking about. There's somebody at your job that you despise because they only work when the boss is there. Other than that, you can't get anything out of them. Wow, it's quiet in here today. Woo. Hopefully I'm not talking to a bunch of man-pleasers. No, I'm just kidding. But you understand the idea here. Now, so the idea, notice what it says at the end. Fearing who? But in singleness of heart, fearing who? Fearing God. Instead of trying to put up a good front to please men, Paul exhorts us to be in singleness of heart, fearing who? Fearing God. Singleness here deals with the basic idea of single attention directed toward one object or being focused on a given purpose. And the reason why is not because the boss or the overseer is standing over you and you're worried about it, but who's always watching you? God. So we work not for that human overseer, not for that human boss, but we work always and in all things in the fear of who? Of God. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing who? Fearing God. You see the difference? I cannot imagine what it would be like to be a lost man and not understand this. Because then all your entire life is just working for somebody and you just strive and you work and you do all of these things, and in the end it didn't really have any higher purpose or value at all. But if you're a believer, you work in the sight of who? God. Fearing God. So the instructions here, folks, are really very clear. Come back to Titus chapter 2. As long as our employer, and I'll give you this when it talks about being obedient, as long as our employers are not asking us to do something that is immoral or unethical, believers should do what their employers ask them to do. You need me to say that again? As long as you are not being asked to do something that is unethical or immoral, you should do what your employer asks you to do. Well, my dad, for about 13 years, fixed refrigerators. He was a service guy. And his boss told him that he needed to sell parts to people they didn't need. He told him this multiple times. And my dad refused to do it. Okay? Because of these verses right here. Do you know that there were plenty of people that did what that guy said and lost their jobs or were fired, but he never fired my dad? I've always thought why, and I think it's because he sort of, even though he might have been mad that he didn't make as much money off my dad as some of the other guys, my dad would not do what was wrong in the sight of God in that instance. My dad's no saint, okay? Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. But in this instance, the boss is putting pressure on him to do something that is unethical and immoral, and he refused to do it. I believe that from what I know from God's Word, unless you are being asked to do something that falls in that category, you should do what your boss or overseer asks you to do. Okay? Now look at what else it says here. Verse 7, exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. Notice, and to please them how? Well. Now look at this. To please them well. I want to look at this. Hold your hand there and come over to Romans chapter 12 for a minute. You need to understand something about what this word means. Romans chapter 12, look at verse 1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, what's the next word? Acceptable. That word acceptable is the same word that's translated please them what? Well. To please someone well is to do things that are what? Acceptable. Read verse 2. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and what? Acceptable. You understand the point. Come over to Philippians chapter 4. Come over to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, look at verse 18. Philippians chapter 4. By the way, mark this because we'll come back here later on. So, Philippians chapter 4, verse 18, he says, but I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well, what? Pleasing to God. So, the instruction, go back to Titus. You can just write down Colossians 3:20, look it up later. Go back to Titus chapter 2 and look at verse 9 again. He says, exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters and to please them how? To please them well. Now listen, in how many things are believers expected or instructed to please their masters?